So the 0th session of what the campaign is actually called, the Fall of Magic, and I'll get into that in a sec, like why it's called that. Essentially, the reason why is because we were planning on doing this campaign as sort of a setup for another campaign, because the idea is, this is an age on this world where um, the magic is was like recently discovered and is very powerful. But something is going to happen that's going to cause the magic to become a lot more like corrupted or have it cause, problems. And we're trying to like sort of build up why that happened, and then as a sequel, we're going to start to like move into another age. So when magic is sort of past or moved, we have less magic sort of thing, or perhaps more, but it's just sort of in the background. Um, so the idea is that this campaign is going to span sort of ages, or at least we are going to have a like sort of a time skip and transition to. I think we were going to end up doing like a burning wheel sort of thing where we have this all these like rivalries and conflicts within the academy district, and I find that very interesting. So so because that's originally what everyone wanted to play, but we said, let's turn it down. Let's make something more like, cause Dor really wanted to do this sort of heroic action or just at least adventure sort of thing. And I was like, yeah, well, I mean, if we're gonna have all this political intrigue and rivalry among the Academy District, that doesn't seem as interesting as, hey, let's go adventure around in this giant forest world and have some fun exploring different things and places and people. More standard, high fantasy adventure kind of thing, like D&D esque. That would be kind of, that's what everyone kind of was okay with. So we ended up deciding to like, okay, let's wind the clock back a bit before all this political intrigue, and let's see what happened when magic was like fresh and brand new, and like everything was sort of building around this sort of thing. So yeah, let's see where that goes. So we went back, we winded the clocks back. Let's see what happens, why the world leads into this new sort of industrial renaissance, because we're building into this sort of new industrialized world as time goes on. Because yeah, I said there are already sort of steampunk elements, and I might expand on that a little more because me and a lot of the other players do like steampunk. So this might end up becoming not necessarily steampunk, but like kind of a like the whole like Eberron sort of arcane punk kind of thing, where we have a lot of like a lot of these like industrial themes without really going too deep into this whole like there are robots, or tanks or things like that. When I did the last game, the steampunk game I did with Carl, where we had tanks and guns and all this stuff, which no, that's probably not where it's going to go, but it's going to have industrial themes. But the industrial themes are related to magic, because what happens in the future, we decided, was that magic eventually becomes a force of industry, and essentially they're using the magical like this magical sort of power source to destroy the forest instead of help, because it becomes this whole, okay, well, once the people start developing this technology, this magic as a technology, what will they use it for? Oh, well, to obviously, lay waste to the forest, they can expand their empire, sort of thing. Very very cliche stuff, but I think it works, especially since it's mostly going to be happening in the background. But I like the idea that now we're starting as this prequel, sort of showing how it built into that. So it's sort of, you see it unfolding as we go. And you're starting to see bits of it, like I said, with the sort of goggles and the other steampunkish elements. You're starting to see, okay, well, maybe we could develop this into more of an industrial period sort of thing. And it probably will get there. And whatever elements I want to include, I'll get to it at some other point. But we're building this as we go, and it's sort of cool because we're building it backwards. Normally when you do prequels, you already have the ending there, and then you go back and you explain. But here it's like, we haven't even figured out where here is exactly, so we can change what happens in the future depending on what they do in this area, in this era of magic. which is why it's called Fall of the Age of Magic, which is the name of the campaign, at least for right now. So anyway, the session 0 starts with Deus going up to the monastery. Like, there's a giant in the city. There's like a hill, so it's built on like a hill, and there's like it slopes upward up to this monastery where like these monks and priests hang out, because they're separate. They're kind of separate from the city, because the clergy has this whole ideal about magic being studied and all that. They disagree with it and all this stuff. So essentially they're sort of like, they're up here on a hill, and the city is like down here. So he goes sort of up this hill to the cemetery, where he knows some people who might know what's going on in the forest are buried. So he has one of the cool things that he did with the Numenera or Cypher skill system was, he's like, oh, I can have any skill I want, right? Can I just have like a digging, because I'm gonna have to dig up bodies and do all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, you definitely know how to dig. They teach you how to, if you're a necromancer, you definitely need to know how to dig a grave or dig out a grave, so to speak. So he starts to dig out this grave of one of his old professors who had died, and he's like, oh well. What he does is he essentially he taps his fingers on their head, and what essentially the way I describe it is that the way the necromancy works is he sort of like implants part of his mana energy into the corpse, and then that will sort of allow it to speak, because the first ability you get as a necromancer in Cypher is basically speak to dead. So if you have a corpse, you can sort of ask it questions or talk to it, but it can't necessarily, like, I describe it sort of, twitching and like having like very small movements, but it's not a high enough level of necromancy unless he tries to do that, but that would actually be freeform, which he could do. But he can't actually make the corpse, rise up and obey his command. And essentially also, this Speak with Dead retains the personality of the person that you're speaking to. So if they're kind of jerkish, they don't even necessarily need to answer your question, or they could answer it in a way where they're like, hey, I know something, but I'm not going to tell you. The power only allows you to like guarantee that you can ask them something, but it doesn't guarantee a straight or correct answer, which I find cool. Although in this case he found somebody that he trusted in sort of a, what's the word? I almost pulled a circles test at a burning wheel. I'm like, well, who would you know that would be buried here? So we came up with someone like on the spot, because that was his plan. Was he was like, oh, I'm just gonna go to the grave and dig up somebody and get some information. I'm like, yeah, it's perfectly legit, and especially in a city where there are probably dead mages who could probably know a lot. So he's like, yeah. So we came up with like, okay, you have a teacher who probably didn't teach you directly, but you might have known him, or he might have been around the college, and he was like this one of these teachers. So he digs up his teacher, and meanwhile in the tower we have the priest Yedea, who is awakening. Yedea is a name. I think it means God is my salvation. Is what Peter, who is the last player of the game, well, not the last player exactly. We'll get to the actual last person later. He came up with that name, and essentially he is sort of this mysterious, which is his descriptor. He's this mysterious priest. Essentially, that's all I want to say for right now. But I will say the sort of interesting thing about Yedea is that he is, he is very convicted man. He has convicted in multiple ways. Convicted as in he's been convicted for things, and he's also has conviction. Maybe I'm saying too much. Perhaps we'll dial this back a bit. Let me try and put this in more direct, but still sort of vague terms. He's essentially, the way we built him, sort of this rogue cleric. Not rogue as in, like, renegade necessarily, but he is a rogue cleric, so the sort of, I was thinking sort of, how they had that Avenger class in 4th edition, that sort of thing, where he's this divine, almost assassin, but I wouldn't use that word. But let's go with that for right now. So that's about all I want to say. He also has this neat quirk where he actually has a voice that will speak to him and give him information. But what that voice is, he and Peter aren't exactly clear on, and I'm not even sure how direct I want to be. Well, you're actually speaking to God or something else, or you don't know, but you believe it to be your God. So it reminded me of that whole idea of like this sort of binding of Isaac. Like you take orders from this God, and he tells you to sacrifice, your son. Or I'm thinking of the Binding of Isaac from the Ed McMillan game where the mother is just like, oh yes, I will kill my son for you, Lord. Sort of the thing. Like, okay, well, if this deity figure is telling you to do these acts of extreme violence, but you still believe that it's a divine decree, then would you still do it? And he is the kind of person who would do it at any cost. Anyway, that's essentially his character. I don't want to get too much into it because it's sort of a mystery to the players as well as to me and to everybody around him. So it's not something where I want to dig too deep into his character because the idea is that he's sort of this mysterious and he holds secrets kind of thing. He wakes up and he sees, but because we want to do something more simple than just, I am a cleric, like, of God, We said, well, okay, you're a cleric, but there's something different about you. So we kind of established all these things. He, while still kind of keeping it, up to the, like, a lot of this stuff is already known. So it's not something, I haven't said anything that wouldn't be already, established. That isn't really that hidden. Anyway, he sees the necromancer digging out this grave, and he's like, oh, okay, well, I better go deal with this. So he actually, like, he rolls his stealth to sort of sneak up, and he passes. So he's basically just, like, watching all this from a distance while this guy is digging out. So he digs up Deus digs up the mage, and the mage says to him, oh, yes, well, I think that if something is going on that like Nero has described, the wilderness sort of living sort of half dragon has told you that this kind of thing is going on, then it means the mana in the forest is unbalanced for some reason, and it could cause catastrophic danger if that were to continue. And so he's like, okay. So he has more of a general idea of what's going on now. So he's like, okay, well that'll help. So he digs him back up, and then he sees the priest. And the priest, Peter is playing him like super intense, which I love. Like this was a great moment where he's just like, he's like questioning him immediately, like, who are you? What are you doing here? And the kicker question was like, well, after he sort of explains everything, he's like, well, do you believe in God? Well, we decided to name it sort of something like Deities. Deities is the name of the deity, and it's different than God in the modern world because essentially there is no it's not Christianity because there's no figure of Christ, which makes sort of Nero being sort of a son of a godly dragon figure interesting because he's the closest thing to a Christly figure we have, and Carl is a Christian. So to me, it's kind of ironic, and so we have this thing where he's like, well, do you believe in deities? This God. We use the name God and deities interchangeably, the same way you would in a normal world, but the idea is they're not the same, but it's essentially like something that's close enough. And there are probably other gods, but like the major human deity would be this, similar to how they have Menoth in the Iron Kingdoms, things like that. So they have like a human deity that's very similar to this sort of Christian dogma, but it's different in a few ways that I'm going to explore later on in the campaign. But the principle is that, we have this, so he says, well, basically, he tells the necromancer, like, you believe in that. Necromancer doesn't. But another cool instance of this system, and this is something you normally have in RPGs, like, he's like, oh, can I have a deception skill, like a lying, like a, bluffing sort of thing? Oh, yeah, sure, go for it. Yep, you can have that, that's fine. So he's like, oh, yes, I do. Rolls deception. 21. And this was sort of a PvP thing. So like, okay, 21. Yudea, you can't really beat a 21 unless you really are scrutinizing him because you can't roll a higher than that on a d20. So he got a really good roll, and he was like, "Yes, I believe in God." And Yudea immediately is like, we agree. When you do PvP, you have to have the players like sort of agree. Like, okay, are you okay with being swayed in this direction? And of course, they agree. Like they're like, this wasn't a moment where we had, well, why that doesn't make sense. Why would I believe him? And it's like this thing where I mean, the idea is that he obviously looks like a necromancer because we established that like in mythos that I've used before that basically necromancers have their hair change color and they look they're red, so they look very different than a normal human. They're essentially corrupted by the necromantic arts, but so it's very obvious if you're a necromancer. So it's not like you can hide that you're a necromancer. You might be able to hide that you're a mage, but if you're a necromancer, it's very obvious to everybody that that's what you are. But ideally, if he says, "Oh, yes, I do believe in God," and he does it in such a convincing way that Yudea is like, "Oh, of course, yes, brother. Well, that's good. Well, did you need help with something?" And he explains, and Yudea is like, "Oh, sure, I'll help you go into the forest and whatnot, and we can investigate this together. I'll help." He's keeping a close eye on, and he's also saying, "Well, I'm gonna keep an eye on you too because you're a necromancer and yada yada." Yada. But he's like, it's not like this thing where they're immediately in conflict like any necromancer and priest kind of combo would be. They're sort of begrudgingly allies, which is cool. They're not killing each other immediately, and I'm hoping that doesn't happen in the campaign. It shouldn't, but it could. And it's not going to go there because these people are very smart. Like, they know not to player kill or do, extremely vicious PvP. Like, we had one scene of PvP, but it was mostly just them having this sort of initial sort of conversation. And that was important to establish they are technically antagonizing each other, but they're not being malicious about it. Anyway, so they form a party basically, and before they're about to leave, I'll introduce the last character before I move on to session 1, because this transitions sort of into session 1. Before they leave, they meet a traveling street magician who is also a sort of a sylph of the storm variety. She is sort of this roguish character who's this traveling street magician, and she picked the wields 2 weapons. So she's sort of this traveling sort of dervish fighter, who's actually like technically the best fighter in the party because she's the one who picked the warrior / glaive / fighting archetype. So she's like this traveling magician who also has skill with using these 2 scimitars. And her name is Rinny. She's being played by Eilina, who has been in my group for a good bit of time now, and she's always fun to have around because she has a lot of experience and she likes playing fairy characters. And I mean, being in a magical forest, there's obviously going to be fairies. So I didn't have a problem with her saying, "Well, I'm going to play this, Storm Sylph." Like, okay, that's fine, So basically this like almost humanoid, not elvish, but like sort of humanoid, sparkling kind of fairy creature with like little wings that you couldn't really fly around with, really. But sort of that kind of thing. Sort of like imagine Tinkerbell, but like really tall and actually like humanoid kind of thing. Yeah. And also with like sort of storm-esque bent to it. She's actually also very shy, which I find kind of cute. So she's like this very sort of shy performer, which is very ironic. It's like this thing where she doesn't typically perform in front of crowds. She usually does it on the street. But if she was like a stage magician, she would freak out immediately. Which is funny to me. Like, she's not very charismatic. She's very shy and demure sort of thing. But when she gets in a battle, she tears things up. Trust me. Like, I'll talk about that when we get to the first session. But essentially, Bureg, who's the sort of wandering mage, like this is the next morning after they sort of arranged that the party leave. Bureg sort of sees her do these magic tricks like on the street, and he's like, "Oh, this is cute. This is magic." And I love the interaction with him and Deus, where Deus is like, "That's not real magic, that's just a trick." And because Deus is like this very calm, very intelligent person, he's like, and he knows, like, he's very smart. So he's not someone who's going to be easily fooled by this kind of thing. And he's like, you know that's a trick, right? Like, that's not actually magic. And Burik's like, ooh, this is cool, because he's sort of this very impulsive, sort of happy-go-lucky kind of guy. Explorer, like, very open-minded kind of guy. So he's like, ooh, this is very fun. So he watches this. He gives her a tip. She hands her a gold piece. And that's sort of where they started their sort of relationship, because after that, she sort of follows behind him. She's like, oh, well, can I go with you? Are you going somewhere? And so eventually, they explain the whole idea. And so eventually now we have the whole party formed of all these people. And then they, afterwards, they met up with Yedea, who was like, oh, like he sees the necromancer and all of his friends now, these two other people, and he's like, okay, well, I guess this is who I'm traveling with now. They're all sort of begrudgingly together, and they sort of all set out to leave town, and that's where they meet in the first session, where they meet up with Nero again, and start to head off